Both of them are speculative in the sense that they imagine worlds that do not exist, but their relationship with, for example, science and the plausibility, the possibility that it may happen, is fundamentally different. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today, a very difficult question, or perhaps a very simple question. Certainly a question that is still being asked today, as is was asked perhaps 50 years ago, and that is, well, what is science fiction and what is fantasy? Is it the same? Is it very different? Is it really two separate worlds, or are they sometimes blending? Now, of course, a very simple answer, a very simplistic answer to that question, what is science fiction, what is fantasy, well, would be to say, well, it's like comparing apples and pears, really. It's like comparing Frankenstein and Lord of the Rings. It's like comparing Game of Thrones or Harry Potter with Greg Egan type of science fiction. Now, of course, the reason such an answer is simplistic is that science fiction and fantasy, while being widely different in many respects, as we'll see in a minute, are, of course, related sorts of genres. They are not the same, and yet they belong to the same sort of space, as it were. Not to want to make a pun on this, of course. So, perhaps one way to approach this, the basic way, as it were, is to remind ourselves that science fiction, here again, the origins of science fiction are heavily disputed by specialists and fans alike, of course. But one could say, of course, that science fiction originates perhaps with Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, of course, 19th century, or perhaps it is Jules Verne, the very famous French writer, also later at the end of the 19th century. It could also be Cyrano de Bergerac, a famous figure, especially because he was then translated onto the stage later, of course, almost 2 centuries later. Cyrano de Bergerac in the 17th century wrote A Voyage to the Moon, like Jules Verne will do, of course, 200 years later. Or is it Poe, perhaps, and his weird sort of fiction, science fiction? Or are the origins of science fiction to be firmly found with the establishing, for example, of those, the first science fiction magazine, I think in the 1920s or 30s in America, perhaps. What is science fiction? Well, it's a bit of everything, probably, and it's not always the best idea to look for the pure origin of something like this. One could go, probably, way back, perhaps Herodotus and his famous history, which is full of crazy creatures and 9 feet tall people. Or perhaps is this then fantasy? Is that more than 2,000 year old history also fantasy? Because what is fantasy really? Well, fantasy in a way, in many ways, perhaps in all ways, is much older than science fiction in that sense, because in fantasy, as we'll see, you often find dragons and wizards, magic spells, sorcery, witches, and of course, those seem to come directly from fairy tales, tales told around the campfire or the fire in the cave. In other words, tales that have been told and transmitted orally for literally thousands and thousands of years. You will remember that the Middle Ages themselves, our Middle Ages, at least in the West, of course, were heavily influenced, culturally speaking, by things like Le Roman de Renard, the Holy Grail type of quest, the Round Table, and all those adventures really are full of, well, sorcery, Merlin the sorcerer, King Arthur and the magical sword. All those elements really smell, taste much more fantasy than they do of science fiction. So that could be a very simplistic answer. On one hand, you've got the science of Frankenstein, use electricity to give life to a dead body. And on the other hand, you have Lord of the Rings with magical elements, magical creatures, talking trees, and the like, and that would seem to be the end of it. Now, of course, the answer is much more interesting than this, because, first of all, as we said, both of them are, even though they are distinct genres, they are indeed related in some sense. And one could say that the most immediate way they are related is that both genres deal in imaginary worlds. Now, of course, the question will be the degree to which those worlds are imaginary in relation to ours. Both genres also have their typical tropes, that is, their recurring sort of elements. And here again, we have to be very, very careful, because it is not always the case that all those tropes come back, certainly in science fiction. But if you think about typical tropes that people would associate with science fiction, then certainly robots, aliens, spaceships, laser beams, interstellar travel, and all those things, time travel. On the other hand, typical tropes, again, typical elements that are constitutive almost of fantasy, abstractly speaking, as it were, conceptually speaking, as a genre. Again, flying carpets could be one, dragons, typically, swords, magic, and a setting as well. And that is certainly a difference between science fiction and fantasy. Science fiction doesn't really have one setting. Space can be a setting, but it's one of many, many. Starship can be a setting, but it's also one of many, many. Whereas typically, again, fantasy tends to have a medieval feeling to it, a sort of feudal system as a social setting, certainly, whatever the place is like itself, of course. And more interestingly, again, for us, what really it characterizes those two genres is that they both have expanded well beyond those original tropes. And despite the fact that even today bookshops are full of really second-rate, one could say, Lord of the Rings, second-rate books about vampires, etc., etc. Second-rate relative to the original is what I mean. Yet both of them are much, much bigger and go way further than those limits, kind of semi-imposed really by best-selling originals, sometimes Hollywood as well, and trends, quite simply, which is not a criticism, it is quite simply a statement of fact, I think. Now, one example that perhaps could bring us into a further division between science fiction and fantasy is to use a quite nice novel. I enjoyed it enormously, I have to say. It's a novel by David Brin called The Practice Effect, and it's from 1984. And David Brin, as I'm sure you know, wrote some very, very, very good science fiction. And science fiction, which is not hard science fiction like Grey Egan, but certainly scientific science fiction, where he speculates about, for example, in Elevation, a wonderful series, he speculates about the cognitive development of some animals and the possible cooperation between different, basically, animals in the world, including humans. Now, the practice effect is completely different, and it's quite an illustration to ease us in this further defining of science fiction and fantasy. Somebody, I can't remember who, to be honest, is in a spaceship and he crashes on some planet. I'm sorry for the sketchiness of the story here, but what matters is not that. What matters is what the guy arrives on that planet. It's a typical fantasy world. So the setting, again, is semi-medieval looking, with a strict sort of social organization and the like. But what is much more fantasy about it is that there seems to be magic at work on everyday gestures, everyday behaviors, everyday objects. So, for example, when you have a harpoon and you want to kill an animal with it, well, the first time you throw it is not very good, right? But then certainly it starts getting better very quickly on this planet. And there seems to be magic at work here, that people can achieve incredible results without any training, except by some sort of magical operation. What is really interesting for us here is that actually David Brin at some stage has his main character investigate scientifically what is at work. And he finds that in fact there's no magic about it. There is a very scientific, rigorous scientific explanation for what is in effect, and it has of course entered our language long since or long before, the practice effect. Practice makes perfect. What does that mean? It's not only a question of training. Here you have a scientific explanation. The practice effect by David Brin encapsulates really what is probably the most evident separation between fantasy and science fiction. And here I will have recourse to a couple of quotes from much better qualified people than myself. Essentially, this separation is that typically science fiction is seen to be dealing with the plausible, something that may not exist now, but which is plausible, and fantasy deals with the impossible. Science fiction deals with a world that does not exist perhaps, or a science, or a technology, or a society that does not exist, but which could exist based on what we know today. And if we expand on what we know today, both scientifically and culturally, socially, then we can start imagining worlds in the future, very near future, 5 years, 10 years, very far future, 100, 1,000, 10,000 years. We can start speculating on what those worlds, those technologies could be like, and we can start speculating on what the development of that future would have on the human race. Whereas, of course, fantasy is much more dealing with the impossible, that is, magic. There is no magic. If you do find a scientific explanation for what is perceived as magic, fair enough, but otherwise, flying carpets on their own simply doesn't exist. Sorry. We all remember, of course, the very famous Arthur C. Clarke quote, which I will mangle, obviously, because I'm doing this on top of my head. But C. Clarke remarked famously that to any human group, as it were, a sufficiently advanced technology appears to be magic. And that is completely true, of course. If you certainly introduce the mobile phone in the middle of the rainforest with tribes that have not been in contact with technology, modern technology, then certainly what you can do with it is magical, whereas you can explain it technologically. But typically fantasy will deal with the completely impossible. So both of them are speculative in the sense that they imagine worlds that do not exist. But their relationship with, for example, science and the plausibility, the possibility that it may happen, is fundamentally different. So fantasy deals with the impossible, and sci-fi again with the plausible. And here I will quote and put on screen a very short quote by the wonderful, the absolutely magical Adam Roberts, an English writer of science fiction, probably the best writer of science fiction, the most interesting at least, writing today. Adam Roberts says, I don't know him, most people, I think, would argue that a science fiction text extrapolates, more or less rigorously and quasi-scientifically, it extrapolates from known in our world into possibles in its imagined world. That's a perfectly sensible thing to argue, of course, and it has the advantage of distinguishing, adds Adam Roberts, it distinguishes science fiction, where the extrapolation needs to stay within the broader guidelines of possibility, from fantasy, where magic, surrealism, and such like impossibilities may enter into the equation. In other words, again, another way of defining it, the relationship with the possible, the plausible, within a semi-quasi-scientific framework, which again, of course, is a very, very loose notion, as we know, and the completely impossible. Ursula Le Guin has this wonderful thing to say, the wonderful, of course, Ursula Le Guin. And if you haven't heard or read Ursula Le Guin, I urge you to go and have a look at the Earth-Sea Quartet, for example. Certainly the first volume is absolutely amazing. The Dispossessed, the Left Hand of Darkness, all those things. And Ursula Le Guin in the Book of Essays says, when I'm asked to define the differences between fantasy and science fiction, I mouth and mumble. Definitions are for grammar, not literature, I say, and boxes are for bones. But of course, Ursula Le Guin adds, fantasy and science fiction are different, just as red and blue are different. They have different frequencies. And if you mix them on paper, I work on paper, you get purple, something else again. And Ursula Le Guin is indeed a wonderful example of that, because she mixes fantasy or fantasy-like elements with science in many of her works. So the Earth-Sea is really concerned with magic, let's say. It is a precursor to Harry Potter. It is, in my opinion, very much better than Harry Potter. But in her book, there is a price to pay for magic. So magic is not separated from the world. It is not something that you do like this with a wand, or you learn a couple of imprecations and there you go. There is a real relationship to the world. And so again, Ursula Le Guin is a very good example of that. Margaret Atwood, in her book of essays on science fiction, because Margaret Atwood is certainly somebody who, while mainstream, uses a lot of science fiction tropes, science fiction premises. Margaret Atwood herself says that she makes a distinction between the type of H.G. Wells science fiction, so War of the Worlds, for example, and Jules Verne. And for her, Jules Verne is a type of speculative fiction within, as Adam Roberts says, semi-rigorous scientific framework, whereas H.G. Wells, Aliens from Mars, for her is more in the Star Wars type of category, that is a sort of extravagant but not scientifically rigorous premise. I would tend personally to slightly disagree with Margaret Atwood here and side much more with Ursula Le Guin, but I do understand and I do agree with Margaret Atwood in the same book of essays that endless disputes about those definitions are probably not serving anybody. Now, what we have therefore is typically, simplistically perhaps, a basic distinction. Science fiction deals with the plausible. It speculates about tomorrow or in 1,000 years on the basis of what we know now. Fantasy is in some ways isolated from our world because it deals in the impossible, very often in a Middle Age-like setting. So we can recognize the sort of social organization, the powerful at the top and the sort of working class at the bottom, and then sometimes the powerful are powerful because they have magic, or because they belong to special families, or because they have magical diamonds, or whatever it is. But typically we recognize the setting, but at the same time that genre, fantasy, is not related specifically to what is going on right now in the world, nor is it based on any scientific or technological development, even societal development, to be honest. This is the end of part 1, where we introduced a first way to distinguish between science fiction and fantasy. If you like this video, of course, thank you very much for liking it, perhaps subscribing to the channel, perhaps even sharing this video where you can. And in the next video, we'll make a few finer distinctions. We'll discuss a very famous theoretical concept to approach science fiction and fantasy, and also give a few mentions perhaps to some novels that straddle the two genres and that sit in between and make use of the two genres. Thank you and see you next time.